Hello.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight for this wonderful piece of history that we'll all learn. First off, I would just like to ask you all to turn off your cell phones. If you do have ringers on, please turn them off so we can all enjoy the presentation. So Martin here, him and his wife moved into the Breakers in October, and I'm so excited for him to share a little slice of history with us. And after the presentation, if you would like, he has some of the books that he has written for sale for $20. If you would like to purchase one, he will autograph it for you. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to new resident, historian, and activist, Reverend Martin Deppe.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored also and delighted to share a piece of Chicago history with you this evening. And I want to start off by thanking Molly for all her help in arranging this event tonight. She was just great with that. Thank you, Molly. I'm going to take this off now. It's going
Good.
that way I can thank her again. Let me begin with a few questions. How many of you were living in Chicago during the years 1966 to 1971, the years of the book story? Oh, yes, that's what I thought. Oh, a majority of you were here then in the area. And who remembers the Willis wagons? Oh, none over here? Quite a few over here. Does anyone remember high-low food stores? Oh, that's amazing. Do any of you remember eating Baldwin ice cream? Oh, good grief. Okay. Who among you had heard of Operation Breadbasket before reading of the announcement of tonight's meeting? Well, that's amazing. And who was and is famous for the chant, "I am somebody"? Well, first, some context. We're all aware the nation began with slavery of the people from Africa, 3/5 of a person in our cherished Constitution. We know the Civil War ended slavery, followed by Reconstruction and then Jim Crow laws and lynchings, which reestablished the white control across the South. And all of this survived, sadly, until the civil rights movement that began in the 1950s. The story of Operation Breadbasket documents just one piece, one slice of the movement. And the original sin of racism and slavery is really a DNA very deep in the soul of America. And unfortunately, it's resurgent today, as you all know. Now, some Chicago context. By 1960, actually, really by 1950, the northern metropolis by the lake here had become divided by a subtle line of color line in housing and in schools and in employment and in politics. And even while the civic creed and what we proclaimed was everyone is treated equally. Well, after the restrictive covenants in housing were outlawed, then the Chicago real estate leaders turned to redlining, effectively further segregating the city. And as our story commences, Chicago had reached almost 1 million African-American residents, 28% of the city's population, divided between the black belts on the south and the west sides. And a neighborhood policy in the schools was essentially a containment policy. It wasn't meant to be, but it became a containment policy where the crowded black schools used double shifts. You may remember them. And then when that didn't work sufficiently, they added mobile buildings, mobile classrooms out in the play yards. And with jobs, Black employment was much higher, in some cases twice as high as that of whites. And there was a glass ceiling above which there were jobs for managers, skilled workers, clerical, and professionals. And the African Americans were hard to find above that ceiling. And in governance, the infamous mayor, Richard J. Daley, had 6 Black aldermen who did the mayor's bidding in exchange for patronage. For good reason, they were called the Silent Six. You get the picture of this context. So while the breadbasket story, Operation Breadbasket, begins with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it began for me when my Methodist bishop, Thomas Pryor, chose not to accept Dr. King's written invitation to join other church leaders in a meeting at Jubilee Temple AME Church in February of 1966, which became the birth meeting of Operation Breadbasket. Instead, the bishop chose not even to choose one of his, I think we had 20 African-American pastors in the Methodist Church, but he chose me, a white and still green pastor from a Southside church, which had just transitioned from white to predominantly Black. And the Gresham neighborhood where I lived and served had undergone radical racial change following the redlining pattern, with a shocking turnover from 40 to 90% Black in 1 year.
Wow.
If in my first year, 40 to 90% Black at 87th and Halsted in that area, south, used to be called South Englewood, and now it's Auburn Gresham. That neighborhood took this incredible change, and most of it took place at night because the whites fled at night. They moved out at night because they couldn't face their neighbors, because they told their neighbors they wouldn't move. And the Blacks often moved in at night because it was safer. So here we had all these semis during the night, changing that the face of that neighborhood was not to be believed. And thanks to this cowardly bishop, I was privileged to be in Breadbasket from the beginning because he asked me to go in his place. Well, in retirement, a necessary task is to go through your stuff. And we've all downsized, haven't we, to come in here?
Oh, yeah.
Well, along about some years into retirement, my wife Peg said, "You got to go to the basement and start clearing this out. We don't want the kids to do all this." And so in the course of downsizing and going through stuff, I came across these files on Operation Breadbasket, and I thought, I wonder how that story is being told. This was about 2006, and I'd retired in 99, and I thought, well, I'm going to go to the local library, Sulzer, the regional library. We were living in Ravenswood Manor, and I went to Sulzer to check it out and just see how the story had been told. And I was shocked to find that it was not in the civil rights literature. Basically, it was a footnote in some volumes. And the famous writer, Taylor Branch, who got a Pulitzer for his 3-volume tome on Dr. King, barely mentions Breadbasket, and then he made mistakes. So I was dumbfounded at this gap in the historical record. And so then one day I shared this finding with the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and I asked his thoughts, and he replied instantly, "Deppe, you kept all the files, you write the book." So with encouragement from some of the other Breadbasket volunteers and workers, and receiving some dusty files from some of them, I set about to write the story in the fall of 2006. So Jerry was still with us a couple of years yet. A second motivation emerged in my conversations. Whenever I would ask a Black person who was doing a house repair, someone standing behind a store counter or sitting next to me in the Brown Line train, have you ever heard of Operation Breadbasket? The answer was almost always no, unlike your answers tonight. And then I would ask, well, have you heard of Operation Push? Oh, I think so. And then if I asked, what about Rainbow Push? Oh, yes. Then they might perk up. What a shame that these people don't know some of their own history. And this is really a widespread problem. Millions of Americans do not know the Holocaust exists. Do you know that? Millions of Americans don't know the Holocaust existed. We're terrible with sharing our stories. We don't have the old Hebraic way of sharing the stories mouth to mouth and around, to keep it going in the families. It's an unfortunate gap. Now to the story. Bloody Sunday was in March of '65. Just recently, we had another annual celebration of marching across Pettus Bridge. And that was in March of '65. And in August of that same year, and then, of course, from that came the Voting Rights Act, signed by President Lyndon Johnson. That was really the culmination of the civil rights movement in the South. The Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act, those two, 64, 65. In August of the same year, urban rioting took place, uprising, I would rather call it, in Watts in Los Angeles. On day 3, with 30 people already dead, Dr. King spoke to crowds amidst the smoldering embers. And when he stood to speak, someone shouted, "We don't want you, Dr. King. We don't want you. Get out of here." Exact words. And another person intoned, "All we want is jobs. We get jobs. We don't bother nobody." The reality of Watts was profound. And then within weeks, against the advice of his closest associates, King made the decision to go north and address the urban crisis. Because as he'd gone across the north fundraising for the movement in the South, he kept running into these ghettos and these severe problems in the north, housing, education, jobs, everything. And he felt that injustice anywhere was injustice for him to deal with. And so he came north. And yet his advisors said, "Don't do that, Dr. King. We've got to implement the Voting Rights Act. It won't happen by itself. We got to see that it happens across the South." And of course, much of it is threatened today by new laws in the states, laws of voter suppression happening almost every week. But for King, this injustice was too much. And after looking at the options in several cities that he looked at, he decided to come to Chicago and was immediately warned by his colleague, Bayard Rustin, "Mayor Daley will crush you." Bayard Rustin knew the dangers of coming into the city, which was so under the control of Mayor Daley. A few years earlier, though, the civil rights movement had already begun in Chicago. It was happening in many cities, and King and the movement was just picking up what was out there. The people were demanding righteousness and justice locally in many places. And in Chicago, it emerged around a school issue. It was the schools. And it was specifically the Burnside Elementary on East 91st Street. That is the birth of the movement in Chicago. The parents were fed up with the education at Burnside. They started picketing. They even went to board meetings downtown. They got arrested. And then their witness drew other people, PTAs, schools, church groups, community groups, and a coalition formed. And do you know what the name of that group finally was? Triple CO. Al Raby, Triple CO. That was the local coalition that from 62 on was fighting for equality in the schools, an end to the Willis wagons, all of that. And we just kept getting stonewalled by Mayor Daley. We were getting exhausted by the time that I'm talking about in 1965, when Dr. King made a decision to go north. And his decision to come north dovetailed with the need in Chicago to have some help. And so the conversation was held, and he came to help us out in Chicago, initially on the school issue. So these uppity parents in the Burnside School really are the foundational pin of the movement in Chicago, and other things then developed around it. Well, as I said, we called these mobile classrooms Willis wagons, and that was it was used derisively for superintendent of schools, Dr. Benjamin Willis. And I vividly recall walking with a group of parents and other pastors and supporters as we circled Willis wagons on a schoolyard at 73rd and Low. And my son Andrew, who's now 59, remembers spending his kindergarten year in a Willis wagon at Ryder Elementary School in our Gresham neighborhood, 87th and Emerald. So after many years of struggle, the movement folk were exhausted. Mayor Daley stonewalled us, and then Triple CO invited Dr. King to come to Chicago and help, and he was ready, heart and soul. His staffers from Atlanta began work on the west side with Jim Bevel, and they for some reason they didn't follow the Chicago movement on schools. They saw the ghetto, and they just decided the housing is the problem. They wanted to focus on housing. So that's the joint group between King's people, SELC, and Triple CO locally together decided, well, let's go with the housing. And the motto was end the slums. Remember that motto? End the slums. And so that's where the Chicago Freedom Movement took its attack. And it was announced with fanfare in January of '66 by Dr. King and Al Raby. They outlined this End the Slums campaign. And then days later, King and his family, Coretta and the children, moved into, at least temporarily, moved into this apartment in North Lawndale. Now, many of the activists in Triple CO, they were a lot of secular people, not just church people. It was a total mixed group. They didn't trust the Black church because they knew that some of those prominent pastors were under the thumb of Mayor Daley and had dependency on him for parking and all kinds of things, and ignoring building violations that were minor, but he could go after them on building violations, so they had to be careful. And so there was a distrust of the Black church. And for King, this was incredible, because in the South, the church was the center of the movement. But in Chicago, it was a different reality. And he quickly sensed that and thought, well, I better have a different project for the churches. Let them be independent of these civil rights crazies, these civil rights people, and let them do their own thing, and they'll be fine. So he brought a project to Chicago for the churches. That was Operation Breadbasket, which he already had going in Atlanta, following a model in Philadelphia with Reverend Sullivan. That model was working in Atlanta. He brought it to Chicago. And at this meeting at Jubilee Temple that I went to for my bishop, as I was about to sit down, a tall man sitting right in front of me stood up. He was taller than I. Turned around and said, "Hello, I'm Reverend King. And right then I met Dr. King's father, who I later learned to know as Daddy King. Then to this overflow crowd of 300 pastors, just a couple of us white, but we were in the black church, in predominantly black churches at least. To this crowd, Dr. King laid out the breadbasket program. They began in Atlanta with bakeries, thus the name breadbasket. And King told us that in 3 years, the power of the pulpit and the purse of the parishioner, power of the pulpit, purse of the parishioner, together created 4,000 new jobs in bakery, dairy, bottling, and trucking companies. They simply went to the heads of these companies and said, if you don't cooperate with us, we need jobs. We're buying your products. We need a share of the jobs too, as everyone else does. And if you can't cooperate, we'll just stop eating your bread. It didn't take long for them to come back to the table and negotiate some jobs. So that's how it kind of began. Breadbasket can be defined as putting bread on the table in the form of a steady job. It's an answer to the prayer, give us this day our daily bread. And our motto was a slice of bread in your community with a picture of bread slices covered in dollar signs. It's right there. And our slogan was, your ministers fight for jobs and rights. That's on some of these posters too. Well, at that historic meeting, Doc, as we call him, Dr. King, laid out a 5-step methodology that we would need to follow. And the first, and in our Chicago experience, it became 6. One was fact finding. You had to know what you're talking about if you were going to talk to a company and ask for more jobs. So you had to get the forms from the government. And since the Civil Rights Act of '64, we now had information that they had to produce. And it was pretty general, but at least it showed it showed all the levels of jobs and the number of whites and blacks in these jobs. We got that information from the government. And then we would ask for more information, of course. But the fact finding was the target, was of a given target was number 1, and we began with dairies and soft drink companies. This was like extracting a tooth. They weren't about to give out information. Second, establishing a fair number of jobs in all categories and making this an opening demand in number 3, which was negotiations. Well, we decided that since blacks were 28% of the population in Chicago, and we only had 5% of the jobs, we should ask for something in between. I mean, you can't expect to go all the way at once. So we set a goal of 20 and often ended up at 10, but we set a goal of 20% of your jobs at all levels, including management above the ceiling, down to the street sweepers and other unskilled workers. These sessions in negotiation felt like a Sunday school class in social justice with Micah as our text. And then if there was no movement, if we couldn't make any progress with the company's CEOs, it was number 4, to the pulpits, where the participating pastors challenged our people to carry their faith and stewardship dollars into action. Purse and pulpit, pulpit and purse. For example, we asked our people to stop drinking Pepsi-Cola until the CEO came back to the table. And this was a withdrawal campaign and a boycott. There were a lot of people that were opposed to boycotts, but this is truly what it was. And this led then to to more negotiations when they saw Pepsi's don't drink Pepsi-Cola signs going up and down in front of a national tea company or A&P or a Jewel or a Hilo. And that didn't go over well with the Pepsi, and they came back to the table within just a few days, really. Those first campaigns went very fast. And this led to number 5, an agreement and a public signing, and 6 then, which we added, was the follow-up, because you couldn't expect they'd just do it. You had to, hold their feet to the fire, all these companies, because if you weren't monitoring them, you could expect slippage. I'm delighted to report that our breadbasket method was used just a few years ago with Mariana's. Any of you shop at Mariana's?
Yeah.
Of course. Well, they put up a store at 39th and King Drive, the old South Park. And during the process of the building of their store and everything, they got a lot of publicity in the black media. And then as soon as the store opened, the black media said, we'd like to continue this relationship. Can we buy some space in your paper? Can you buy some ads? Oh no, we're just word of mouth. We don't do any advertising. Well, Hermaine Hartman, the publisher of Indigo, it's kind of a digital black magazine. Hermaine Hartman, and who was a teenage volunteer in Breadbasket. She was now the publisher of Indigo, and she had just read my book. So she pulled together the black media people and the Daily Defender and some others, and they proceeded to negotiate with Mariano's, and they got ads in the black media. They pulled it off, and one of the participants said, we borrowed a page from good old Breadbasket days. Now, we met as a steering committee every Friday afternoon. Jerry and I were always late. I'm kind of talking on the side to a widow of my closest friend in life, really, and longtime colleague and shared ministry, Dr. Reverend Jerry Forshey, his beloved wife, lives in Breakers, Florence, and her sister Emily. And Jerry and I would finally get there, and that was called CP time, actually. We were, and that's colored people's time, but here come in 2 whites late. They always joked about that. And we met at the dingy basement of Fellowship Baptist Church at the invitation of Reverend Clay Evans, who just died a few years ago at 90. And King would attend whenever he was in town. The first target just fell right into our lap when Country Delight Dairy refused to give out any data, and one of their officials declared he was not about to let Negro preachers tell him what to do. But after 3 days of leafleting their stores, they were at the table. As one of our pastors said, milk cannot be sent back to the cows if people do not buy it. Well, with Country Delight, we netted 44 job openings, including 15 truck driver jobs. Those were good jobs. And that was visibility. That was a black in the neighborhood, and we didn't have to just have white drivers coming in and bringing in foods and beverages into the hood, into the neighborhood. And then with salaries averaging $7,000 a year, $7,500, right in that range, average for the jobs at all levels. We were bringing in $300,000 new dollars into the community annually, just with that one company, Country Delight. Almost immediately, Dean Foods took us to the pulpits again, and 3 days later, they capitulated for another 40 jobs. And a Dean spokesman said, you can't beat them. They got that weapon, and you have to respect it. If you don't, you can go broke. Then one of our pastors noted, bread, not bullets, is the only ammunition against riots in Chicago. Well, there were riots in Newark and Detroit, and there were riots in other cities, and there was a great fear of it, and we had them too in Chicago, even before the destruction around King's death in '68. So we'd had two before that, not to mention 1919. But one of our pastors said, bread, not bullets, is the only ammunition against riots in Chicago, as I said. If I may say so, bread, not bullets is still an answer to a city with large numbers of despairing young Black people, not in school and not working and on the streets. And I think jobs would help bring dignity and daily bread, would surely reduce the grasping for guns as a tool for heaven's power and might. So it's just an ongoing problem we all live with. Every campaign was unique. Country Delight, 3 days. A&P, 3 months. And it was a slog because King had been assassinated in April, and this was the summer of '68. We were in tears, we were broken down, and we were tired. And A&P was slipping away. Both A&P and National didn't know how to deal with the urban setting or with the changes. They were both slipping down in their closing stores and downsizing, to say the least. And we weren't quite aware of that, and we over-expected in our demands with both A&P and National. We finally did get a covenant with A&P. We called them covenants. That's a biblical term. We didn't call them contracts. It wasn't a legal document. When they signed a covenant, it was that they would do this and we would do this. It was an agreement. And Red Rooster was a small chain. Anybody remember Red Rooster? Oh, good grief, you do some. They were a small chain of 7 stores, and they sold spoiled meat. And their response was to use Black employees as counter pickets. They never recovered. They sold their business, which then collapsed. And as I say, National just became toast in Chicago. They couldn't make it. And our biggest targets were Walgreens. Imagine that today.
Yeah.
Imagine the number of stores Walgreens has across the world. So we had Walgreens and Sears were the biggies. And tough slogs too, of course. And we gained a solid agreement with Walgreen Drugs in 1970, signed by Charles Walgreen himself. Well, there's a telegram he sent to me. I was on the committee. That's from Charles Walgreen. And we had a pretty good agreement. That was a much smaller operation then. It was basically Chicago area store. It wasn't worldwide. And but our best covenant was with Jewel Tea Company. They seemed to understand what we were doing, and they figured they could expand into the Black community. And so what happened was, it was reciprocal. They were expanding and using us, and we used them for jobs. So it was a very mutual thing. We had teams for research and for negotiation and follow-up. We were organized, we were disciplined. And in our meetings, the CEOs didn't always know what hit them. And each member had a specific role. Jesse Jackson was the quarterback, of course. And then we had a scribe who took down the key quotations. And then we always had Hiram Crawford, the prophet, shouting like Micah. And then the pastors would tell personal stories of discrimination with biblical references. And then we had a knife who cut open the issues. This was the Reverend Gerald Forshey I mentioned a few minutes ago. He just could see to the bottom, and he just cut the thing right open and really forced the CEOs to deal with these issues. The super conscious was this old, retired woman pastor, self-appointed, I think, Reverend Jessie Ma Houston. who had a ministry in the county jail. In fact, she could go anywhere in the county jail, absolutely anywhere, where even the warden could not. And she was the super conscience, and her look alone produced guilt. We even had a bastard. Father Bill Hogan was the sweetest man you ever met, but he never agreed to anything during a negotiation. And he loved playing that role. We had a bulldog, we had a shopper, and finally we had a skeptic. On all the data that was passed out to us, guess who the skeptic was? That was me. And so the evidence of our economic impact could be seen in the growing numbers of African Americans at all levels of employment: truck drivers delivering Pepsi-Cola, apprentices in the meat department of stores, Baldwin ice cream, Joe Louis milk on the shelves, Black scavengers backing up to supermarkets, and increasing use of Black-owned banks, independents, and Seaway National by our community people. And seeing all this change brought a sense of dignity. I am somebody. And a renewed confidence in our ability to make changes and to support our people and to empower local businesses. So during the 6 years, Breadbasket, I'll mention later why it folded, but from 66 to 71, we netted at least 4,500 jobs. That's very conservative because that doesn't count the jobs that were produced by the products that were sold, or even in service contracts, just the jobs that we negotiated for in the companies. And we netted at least that, and then with everything together, we netted about $57 million a year annually. Annually from all these parts of the Breadbasket operation, which in today's money is $450 million. So it was a significant chunk. We were a player in the economics of Chicago. Now, Jewel, which I said was our best covenant, had 12 Black employees in 1964, and not one Black employee of the 12 was allowed to touch money. Can you believe it?
Yes.
Well, they started making improvements. I mean, they had a more liberal staff and leadership, and they started to move up from 12. So that by the time Breadbasket came along, they saw we were on the way coming to them. They really got into it, and they jumped to 273 employees, or 4% Black, when we negotiated with them in April of 67. So from 64 to 67, they went from 4 to they went from 4 to 273. And then by 71, they were at 1,000, just shy of 1,000, according to the records that they submitted to me. I've chaired a follow-up with Jewel. The increase in jobs alone, with them, not counting the products and services, was over 4 million. So that through Breadbasket covenants, our gain in jobs, in Black-owned products, service contracts with janitors, advertising, and construction came to 57 million. But Breadbasket now was more than just economic empowerment. It was that, essentially, jobs. But it was more than that. We expanded into a cultural hub for Black Chicago and then the nation, with Saturday worship rallies attended by 4,000 people at the peak. And on any given Saturday, we had leading figures in business, entertainment, politics, sports, and the church from across the nation. Harry Belafonte, Jackie Robinson, Senators McGovern and Percy, Cleveland's Mayor Carl Stokes, Aretha Franklin sang with us a number of times, Coretta Scott King, Adlai Stevenson III, who just died, Joe Louis, Sidney Poitier, who just died. They were all there at our meetings. on Saturday. And we had divisions of business entrepreneurs, public school teachers, breadbasket women, political education classes, Black expos, prison ministry, a cadre of doctors and nurses, a talent bank, an orchestra and choir, and then we established breadbasket chapters in other cities. And a teenager, Al Sharpton, was a youth leader in the New York chapter. That's where he got his start. So Jesse is his mentor. Breadbasket was an extraordinary movement. When I interviewed Reverend Clay Evans, he told me, our time together in Operation Breadbasket was providential. God brought us together, preachers, lawyers, business people, all kinds of people. We were a bridge between cultures, races, and denominations. Operation Breadbasket was an arm of the church. We couldn't get the whole church behind us. How could you get the whole church on any issue behind you? To do the justice work, but we were an outreach of the church, and together we were able to do it. And I have to say, as I said in my book, quote, it was a privilege of a lifetime for me, a still unproven white pastor, to work and worship side by side with these giants of the Black church in Chicago. Breadbasket's overall impact was empowerment, really Black power. Though King felt that that was a derisive phrase when it was used as a slogan, he didn't like it. It was not useful. Breadbasket empowered people in the pulpit to seek justice collectively through their modest consumer dollar. The entire face of Black Chicago took on a smile and a hope and a radiance that touched the city. And that empowerment included a series of political education classes where a whole generation of young Black folk, future aldermen, lawyers, and organizers were being prepared unknowingly to themselves and inspired for a campaign that 12 years later elected Chicago's first African-American mayor, Harold Washington. It didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't happen by itself. The political education classes literally were run by her mother. And that's her daughter. She's a teenager here. Now she's retired, 72 years old in Phoenix. But Alice Tregay and her mother, same name, Alice Tregay led those political education classes that really arced and took us toward the election of Harold in 83. And then eventually someone else that got elected to an even higher office. It's all part of a flow, an ebb. The arc of history, as King called it. Well, before I close, I want to just share a couple of vignettes straight out of the book, if I may. May I go on a few more minutes? I've gone longer than I expected, but that's because I ad-libbed in between. One day I found myself sitting next to Rosa Parks on the rostrum at New Fellowship Baptist. Next to us were Representative John Conyers of Detroit, Reverend Stroy Freeman, host pastor, and Reverend Jesse Jackson. We were speakers at an SCLC Operation Breadbasket worship and rally. I remember thinking I was the token white preacher. The diminutive woman beside me seemed half my size. As the event dragged on, I started a conversation with Mrs. Parks, asking about her work and life in Detroit. She had fled to Detroit because her life was threatened very severely in Montgomery after the bus boycott and her sitting down on the bus. Life wasn't easy. She had to leave town. She spent her whole life in Detroit. So I wanted to talk to her about her life and work she worked for Representative Conyers in his office in Detroit. She gently turned our talk to me, wanting to know about my church and the ministry in the Black community. She was soft-spoken, meek. After she was introduced at the podium, she spoke a few words of encouragement and returned to her seat to respectful but mild applause. This quiet but strong lady of the bus, as I like to call her, had not yet become an icon in the movement, but I felt blessed for this time with her. It all seemed so natural in those heady, hopeful days. And then at the conclusion of, this is another one, at the conclusion of a follow-up session with Jewel officials at H&H Restaurant, 51st Street, H&H Restaurant, anyone?
I remember it.
We gathered in a circle. We always ended with prayer, even in these rough negotiations. As convener, I requested Ma Houston to offer a closing prayer, whispering to her privately, "Keep it short, Ma. We're way beyond time." She stared at me with a scowl covering her long face, and she declared aloud for all to hear, "Reverend Deppe, of all people, you should know you cannot put a limit on prayer. Prayer has its own time. It's God's time." Then she turned to the group and said slowly, "Let us pray." And then she delivered an eloquent, spirit-filled prayer, which seemed, at least to me, to cover most of the human concerns around the globe. My pastoral prayers have never been the same, by which I mean a sense of openness to the Spirit, hopefully not to length. And then one about Dr. King. Sometime in the fall of '67, Dr. King arrived at a steering committee meeting at Fellowship Baptist with a coterie of 5 or 6 persons, bodyguards, and secretary and others. He sat for a short time. He usually sat in the back, took notes. He didn't speak. He was always learning and adding things for his own speeches. And the operation was going fine. Didn't need him to interfere, so he just sat in the back. But on this particular day, he was troubled. We could see it, and he asked to speak. And so he was obviously distracted, and he said, "I'm among trusted colleagues here, and I want to share something personal. This past week, I received more death threats here in Chicago." And he indicated that he and Coretta had faced it and were prepared, but he went on, "Let me be honest. I'm truly frightened for myself and for Coretta and the children." Dr. King continued to talk about fear and how Jesus offers us strength for life, forgives our sins, and takes care of our deaths in his own death. And he seemed to gather courage as he spoke, declaring that he would find the strength to carry on. And we all gave him strength as members of the body of Christ. He would not be deterred from his mission. It was a frightening moment. And I think we all trembled for him, yet the resiliency of his faith shone through an angst-filled voice. And as he talked through these fears, he was also preparing us, his fellow pastors, for what lay ahead. When he was killed some months later, I remembered that precious episode of confession and faith. He wavered, was frightened, but he found renewal and refreshment to carry on. Well, in conclusion, all this came to an end on Christmas Day, 1971, after a long struggle between Jesse Jackson and Ralph Abernathy of SCLC. Ralph had been Dr. King's chosen successor, but Abernathy did not have King's strengths or charisma at all. He had the loyalty and the commitment, but he lacked some of the gifts, and Jesse just decided, "I've got the gifts that he doesn't have. I should be the head of this thing." So Jesse had a big ego. As good as he was, his ego was always up front and center. And I had to deal with that many a time. What Jesse took the whole staff and the money and the whole thing into a new operation called Operation Push. People United to Serve Humanity, Christmas Day, '71. That was the end of Breadbasket. The chapter existed on paper for a few more weeks and months, but it was done for. And I was so crushed that I didn't go into the new operation. Most did, but I didn't, and I kept my files. And it's a good thing I kept my files. But Push went on, continued as a national organization, using the breadbasket model effectively with large nationwide companies. And years later, when Jesse ran for president of the United States, 1984 and 88, he merged two groups into Rainbow Push, which continues to operate today at Dr. King's workshop in an old Jewish synagogue on Drexel Boulevard. Some heads are going up and down. Just a stone's throw from where former President Obama lived. You could actually take a baseball and throw it from Jesse's headquarters to Obama's house. You can still hear Jesse and son Jonathan in tone in a smaller movement congregation still on Saturday mornings on WVON 1690, or watch them streamed live on Rainbow Push website available across the nation. It's important to note now in my final thoughts here that Breadbasket is part of a whole string of freedom fighters and groups, from Harriet Tubman to Frederick Douglass to Sojourner Truth, W.B. Du Bois, the NAACP, CORE, SNCC, Medgar Evers, Dr. King, and many others, heroes and heroines, and many people who unnamed, who participated and had to deal with dogs and fire hoses and all kinds of opposition along the way. And along with Breadbasket and Jesse Jackson, this all led the way to Obama's election in 2008. And now we're living in a terrific reaction to that. So many people in the nation say we don't want blacks leading this country. This is a white country, so we've got a problem on our hands, don't we? But it's a long line of splendor and sacrifice, and much of the gleam is worn off. And much of this history has been forgotten, but Operation Breadbasket with the youthful Jesse Jackson and his charisma and his energy and innovative leadership, it really played a role in making Chicago a better city and the South Side a stronger community, and really with a new and growing, more vibrant middle class in the Black community. And the 6-step praxis that we developed with King is a model, still worthy to make systemic social change. And Breadbasket's achievement is a worthy story to share with people today, and it can enlighten and encourage social change and encourage new dreams and engender new adventures on behalf of justice and the beloved community. This was my 37th presentation. I haven't done one since before COVID, but this was, and I love doing it, and you were so attentive. I can't tell you what this means to me personally. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're what? Part two? Well, let's think about that, James. You're welcome to run to the elevator, some of you. But if you want, you can look at some of these posters that I kept. Here, this is an enlargement that the Herald Washington did for me in my presentation when I put my collection of all my civil rights stuff down at Herald Washington. We had an exhibit, and this is an enlargement of the letter from Dr. King. And so there's just some things here you might want to see. And then I've got books here, which I'll autograph if anyone wants one. But you could get it from the library. Where's the librarian? Stand up. Eleanor?
This is the book, Operation Breadbasket, an untold story of civil rights in Chicago, 1966 to 1971, by Martin L., how do you pronounce your last name?
Deppe.
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 Okay.
So it's in the library. Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you. It's on the history shelf.